All right, everybody, thanks for coming in today. It's good to see everybody after a bit of well, I was gone for a bit. Um, so today we're very fortunate to have Martin Bush, who everybody knows, coming and talking to us about visual culture and the pictorial turn in the history of science. So, without further ado, take it away.
Yeah, okay. So thanks everyone. So as Dwayne's already mentioned, this is going to be not quite as extensive as I would have liked, given for a range of reasons. I had a relatively short notice that I was presenting this seminar this week. I've just submitted a future fellowship and I've already given a talk today. But so I'm going to talk about what it says on the title. I'm not actually going to make huge links to cultural astronomy through this talk. And in fact, I expect that a lot of the kinds of conclusions or, sort of findings that I will refer to will in fact be quite, sort of unsurprising to cultural astronomers. But I'm going to really sort of talk about, sort of the way some of this visual culture has been studied through the history and philosophy of science. So I am a senior lecturer in history and philosophy of science. My involvement in cultural astronomy is, I do think it's slightly less usual than other people's involvement with cultural astronomy because my background is in well, initially in museums, and you'll see very soon on the next slide how I got from museums to the history of astronomy. Um, my research is mostly in the history of popular astronomy in um, Australia and New Zealand, and more broadly in Western European contexts in through the 19th century, 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. And so, what I found myself doing in the course of my PhD and subsequently is, in fact, investigating the culture of astronomy of colonial Australians, of sort of European and North American immigrants to Australia and the kinds of culture of astronomy that they developed. And so it's a useful reminder, I think, that cultural astronomy is not just something that other people do, that Europeans, in fact, had really strong myths and cultures and socializations around astronomy themselves. And so that's, sort of most of the work that I've done. So I did say that, sort of I started off in museums, and when I was at Museum Victoria, I got really fascinated by the astronomical lantern slide collection that was there, and I went off to do my PhD on objects like this. It turns out that Museum Victoria has, in fact, not just, the best collection of these things in Australia, but in fact, it's a collection that is of clear international significance. It's one of the best collections anywhere in the world in terms of complete astronomical lantern slide sets. So it sort of meant that there was a little bit less to research after having left the museum on some of these than I was expecting. So I sort of slightly modified my PhD research to a more broader investigation of popular astronomy in Australia. But so for people who are unfamiliar with astronomical lantern slide set, the lantern slide or magic lantern, as it's often referred to, was a projection technology that was very prominent into the 19th century. Its origins actually go back as far as the 17th century, but by the 19th century, it had become a public media form, of major significance. So it's like the 19th century and an earlier version of a slide projector. These images would be projected. They could be projected, sort of quite large, 6, 7, 8 meters across, depending on the brightness of the lantern that you had, and were performed all around the world in, sort of many different settings. in fact, the lantern, the magic lantern, created a screen culture in 19th century, in the 19th century world, Western world, certainly. Although the lanterns were used all around the world, not just in the Western world. Uh, I don't know how many of you have ever heard that story about there's a story about when the Lumiere brothers first showed their film, I forget it, sort of Passengers Waiting for a Train, which shows like one of the first films of a train just coming straight at the camera. There's this story that goes around that when audiences first saw that, they in panic ran out of the theater because they thought that there was, sort of a train was about to come through the wall. The story's a complete myth, and it's been, sort of historically debunked, sort of from, sort of sound historical reasons from many times. But one of the reasons for thinking that it's quite mythological is that it's the audiences who were watching that had an incredibly sophisticated screen cultures. They were not dupes who thought that a moving image on the screen was somehow impossible, and so this must be reality that they were looking at. Late 19th century, early 20th century audiences had an incredibly sophisticated screen culture, largely through devices like this. And these are static images, but a lot of the lantern slides included animated effects. So there are versions of the solar system slides where you've got this incredibly intricate orrery construction where by turning a handle, the planets would all revolve at different speeds around the sun, showing the relative motion. So yeah, incredibly important. The slide on the right is, I think one of my favorite lantern slide images ever. Does anyone want to hazard a guess as to what it is actually communicating, what it is doing? Can anyone interpret that image?
Comets.
On the right-hand side. No, the left-hand side is showing the, sort of the perfection of the Newtonian solar system, which includes both the orbits of the planets, but also the highly elliptical orbits of, showing that it's, historical development, perfected in the English tradition, of course. These images were very, we're not neutral, as I will get on to later, we're not neutral in values by any means. And a lot of these British lantern slides were presented very much in a, sort of British tradition. It's like, yeah.
Sorry, what period were these from again?
So this is about roughly 1850. You can often date the slides by how many moons are appearing around the different planets. So you'll see that there's Jupiter's got, sort of 4 moons. Saturn's got, can't count how many. And
It kind of reminds me of when you see Venus goes through the phases, because it'll be further and closer at different points in time, and it shows the different sizes, but I don't know how that would work on here.
You do get, sort of some nice demonstrations of the, sort of the greatest elongations of Venus. What that's showing, it's a counterfactual slide. What it is showing, this is a proof of how we know that the sun is larger than the Earth, because if the Earth was larger than the sun, then the shadow of the Earth would expand continuously into space, and all of the outer planets would be seen going into eclipse. And that's true, even if the sun and the Earth were exactly the same size. But because we do not see that, we can have evidence that the Earth is smaller than the sun. So it's just, I love it because it's, like it's bizarre, and it's also this kind of counterfactual argument, which you would not get away with in a modern planetarium, I can assure you. And so, sort of going in that, we'll touch on this, sort of later as well, but some of the work that I've done with these lantern slides is talking about the way that particular values about science are embedded in the aesthetics of science. So the slides that we saw on the last slide and the one on the right have those very mathematical, very geometrical form. They really engage with that idea that astronomy is a mathematical subject. It's geometric, it's perfect, we're looking at things from the, God's eye perspective, looking down on the solar system. And those are very common tropes about astronomy, that it's, that it's mathematical, it's pure, it's perfect. It's the ideal science. Whereas on the left, we have an image that, sort of is maybe not a masterpiece of art, but is very firmly placed in that kind of romantic tradition of art from around this period, where what's being represented is this incredibly, sort of evocative place-based experience of seeing a comet. And so the values that, sort of are embedded in this are very much about the, sort of about the wonder and the romantic sense of the connection to the individual that these kinds of experiences, including the experience of astronomy, provide. So same medium, same, sort of time period, same kind of communicate, but incredibly different values about what is represented by the science of astronomy encoded within those images. Okay, so that's all a very, sort of long precursor of, sort of what I've done and what I've worked on. So what I'm going to, as I said, sort of before, what I'm really going to do is, sort of not so much, sort of, there will be bits of my analysis in here, but I'm not really going to describe much of my work. I'm just going to kind of give a fairly high-level overview of some of the major resources that are used in studying these visual cultures within the history of science. And so the term, the pictorial turn, was coined by screen cultural studies scholar William Mitchell back in the actually in the 1980s, but sort of particularly around end of the 1980s, and it's been taken up broadly within the humanities and history. There are a lot of people who criticize the humanities with some justification about the constant use of the turns, the cultural turn, the pictorial turn. We're always turning to things. Sort of some people suggest unkindly that we should just get on and do the business instead of turning all the time. But nonetheless, it's, sort of has been something that's been picked up, reflecting the fact that, of course, well, we speak from the perspective of historians, but historians historically, no pun intended, have really focused on texts and textual documents as their primary source of analysis. And, of course, for, sort of reasons that we've discussed, obviously, sort of in this room, we're all interested in the bias against oral histories in favour of manuscript material. But the other thing that became evident through the work of, Mitchell and all of the other people that, sort of picked up on this was the bias against using images as sources of evidence for historical and other studies in the humanities. And that's just a nice little book by Peter Burke, who's, sort of quite a good influential historian that just runs through sort of these ideas of how you might use images as historical evidence. And some of the things that he draws about is that pictures can give evidence of symbolic meaning and, sort of religious and spiritual understandings. They can give evidence about particular values that are held at either social or individual levels. One of my favorite PhDs was a PhD on astronomical frontispieces, because, as you know, the images that are placed at the beginning of books can be incredibly, sort of informative about what was valued by the author and the publisher or patron of that particular work. So, that's an incredibly interesting analysis that you can go into there. But images also give kind of direct historical evidence of things that are often not picked up in texts. So images will often capture the machines, the daily life, the material culture of a place in a way that is rarely explicitly described in texts, and similarly picks up aspects of social history. So again, in my own work, sort of one of the things that's interesting is that I've done work on tours of some popularizers of astronomy who came through Australia in the late 19th century. And if you read the reports in the newspaper and other published reports, you would be forgiven for thinking it was just like bloke, 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 bloke. And then maybe the governor's two daughters sitting in the box with him. But when you look at the images that appear on the illustrated newspapers of the day, lo and behold, you see that the front row is actually mostly women, coming to these shows. And this is, consonant with other evidence that we have from this period that this form of popularization was actually was very, sort of useful for women, mostly middle-class educated women, to engage with scientific events because they were excluded from a whole lot of other forums for scientific discussion. So they were often extremely enthusiastic about this kind of popularization activity. But if you just look at the texts, you might be misled by that. But, sort of you look at the images of it and, sort of it's pretty good evidence of what's going on. But of course, when you come to social history as well, then you need to, given that where images portray these kinds of values, this kind of evidence can also be showing stereotypes or, sort of particular negative social attitudes that are held by particular groups as well. So, sort of all kinds of reasons for attending to images within history. But, sort of you said, they also portray the values of science. So, sort of again, just, sort of largely because I can, you've already spoken about that romantic tradition of science, particularly associated with Alexander von Humboldt, but also in Australia, people like Ludwig Leichhardt, and in this case, Ludwig Becker, artist on the Burke and Wills expedition. And that romantic view of science really sees, sort of the scientific endeavor is something that, sort of needs to be a total expression of place and of environment, that you can't just sort of study things in isolation, pull them apart. So an illustration like this is, sort of a beautiful example of that. It's both, representing factual matters, yet it's also doing so clearly, this is an imagined perspective. Ludwig Becker is not sketching himself from, an out-of-body experience. He's, would be, sort of with the camel train. They're not parked, they're like sort of moving. So there's sort of imagined elements of it, but it's also, trying to be an expression of the place and of the location. So, sort of again, that's a, sort of a representation of a particular value about doing science. This is coming more from the art tradition, but we see, sort of a very similar kind of image or kind of expression. But this is, sort of from someone who's not uninterested in this. Is from the painter James Poole. So this is Donati's comment, the comment of Donati. One of the most spectacular comments that appeared over Europe in the 19th century, and obviously draw enormous amount of attention. There was heaps of visual representation of it. But so, I just point here is really just to compare that, we've got similar kinds of visual tradition, but this is done by someone whose express purpose is to document a scientific expedition for those purposes. And this is an image that is just, sort of just a fine art expression of the artist's experience of their place. So the point here is that, it is, come back to this right at the end, that images, sort of TLDR, like images always need to be interpreted within a visual culture, but images can be particularly powerful for showing those relationships between different cultures, in this case, the culture of landscape painting and the culture of Humboldtian science in the ninth. They're not, they're not obviously completely separate. They are something that is brought together by this kind of visual practice. Okay, images are not just evidence for the history of science. They're also objects for the history of science. And so because images themselves have been, incredibly productive techniques for doing science. And, on the right, we've got two famous examples of these kinds of diagrams. The top is the Feynman diagram, which is used as a way of helping to calculate out particular, sort of quantum electrodynamical calculations. It's a way of, sort of work of the physicist being able to work out, okay, what are the terms I need to include in my calculation? And at the bottom is the version, and one of Mendeleev's first versions of the periodic table as a way of organizing the elements of the chemical elements. And using these kinds of sketches, notations, diagrams, and so forth facilitates the ability to do the work of science. There's no question about that. Mathematical notation itself is, another classic example of that. If anyone's sort of familiar with the history of mathematics, might be aware that mathematics in England post-Newton was held back because the English tradition continued to use the notation that was developed by Newton. Whereas continental mathematicians used the notation that was developed by Gottfried Leibniz, which proved to be a far superior. So the continental mathematicians made progress in mathematics because of the kinds of tools, paper tools that they were using in a way that the English and British mathematicians couldn't make equivalent progress until they, sort of gave up on Newton's stupid notation and adopted the standard of the continentals. And so this ability for diagrams and sketches and doodles and stuff to actually do cognitive work for scientists is brought together in a number of works, but probably the most famous of them is this idea from philosopher of science Ursula Klein of paper tools, that to just writing things down on a paper is itself sort of an important tool for a lot of fields of science. So diagrams and notations become sort of important objects of science in terms of practice of science, but of course in terms of scientific evidence themselves. And here the key idea is expressed by a number of people, but I particularly like the one done by Lorraine Daston, and this is a concept of epistemic images. Now, that's a term that's been used quite widely and in many different contexts and meanings. Sorry, excuse me. And with slightly different definitions. So some people define an epistemic image as basically being anything that does cognitive epistemic work for a scientist. Lorraine Daston uses a more restrictive definition, which I'm more partial to, which is that an epistemic image is an object that serves in a scientific dispute. So it's something that is able to intervene into an active research question and provide some form of evidence for that. Now, obviously in research astronomy, these kinds of epistemic images are absolutely, sort of everywhere, even if they're not, sort of any often, they're often mediated images these days rather than sort of direct images, but nonetheless, images like, radio map of the galaxy just at the time when that was first being taken was, sort of an epistemic image in this narrow sense. it's not so important from here. I have an argument that, you know, if we use the restricted version of epistemic images as images that are capable of standing within a scientific dispute, then we have to think about what happens to the images that that no longer represent an active dispute. So images can actually change their form over time, something that's an open question and that an image might be intervening at one point of time becomes a teaching tool that everyone knows, everyone in the scientific community accepts that this image is, you know, doing what it says it does, but we use it as a teaching tool. So, you know, I make an argument that you think about the shift from epistemic images to didactic images, but that's, you know, sort of a slightly tangential thing. Actually, that's why I was going to put a picture of the plaster images of the moon from Naismith and Carpenter. Is anyone familiar with the photographs of Naismith and Carpenter of the moon? Simulated photos. At the end of this, I'll quickly log off and pull some up. They're fantastic. But what they was in the James Naismith was this engineer, British engineer. He made a whole lot of money really early in his life by inventing the steam hammer, which I'm not a historian of engineering, so I don't really understand what it is any more than those words suggest, but apparently it was incredibly important in engineering and made him a ton of money, which he then meant he could basically retire at 30 something. And devoted the rest of his days to astronomy, which was his true passion. And he just was particularly involved in studies of the moon. What he ended up doing was, because, you know, photography of the moon at that stage was still not amazing, what he did was he built these plaster landscapes of the moon, 3D surface of the moon, and would then light them and photograph these models to represent as faithful as he could what he saw through the telescope. So incredible objects of science. I'll pull some up at the end and I'll, you know, sort of talk more about them. But that was a really interesting use of simulation. I suggest that is actually the first. Astronomers were very reluctant to embrace any kind of simulation practice until Naismith did this work. And I think that was the first time in the history of astronomy that astronomers embraced this idea of simulated images. That's another matter. So, you know, epistemic images incredibly important for the practice of science, but all of these are, you know, sort of obviously mean requiring, you know, sort of an interpretation of these images within particular visual cultures, and, you know, to make some level of connection to cultural astronomy in this talk, that's, you know, sort of Alec Topati's installation in Monaco turtle, but, you know, sort of, I mean, the people in this room that will be able to speak much more than I can about the kinds of symbolic meanings that are generally embedded in these kinds of images, the layers of meaning that are embedded in these kinds of images, and the way that the interpretation of those, the interpretation of different layers depends on the kinds of culture and visual culture that you've been enculturated into. So this is true of the interpretation of scientific images as much, you know, sort of as it is of any other kind of image. And so again, like, you know, sort of making the point that hopefully most of you have read the Elkins article, so you might be able to going to that there is enormous benefit in not trying to separate out scientific images as completely separate from different kind of images, because the interpretation of them in many ways is very similar. And one of these, you know, sort of things that is really important for understanding all kinds of images, including scientific images, is that the interpretation of them happens within particular cultures, but these cultures have histories. Now, this is probably the most famous work in this field. This would be one of the most famous books in the history and philosophy of science of the last 50 years. I think would not be too, sort of hard, sort of being too hard to say, certainly, sort of in the last 25 years. Objectivity by Lorraine Daston, who we've already seen, and Peter Gallison, absolutely eminent historian of science. And their argument through this book is that the idea of objectivity is not something that is static. It's something that has a history. It's something that people work to create forms of scientific objectivity, and that through it's not exactly the 19th century, leading up to the 19th century, through the 19th century and into the early 20th century, these different ideas about what objectivity was proceeded through visual media, and so this is sort of a study of the different kinds of objectivity that was encoded in different kinds of images. And they suggest that there's a broad sequence over this history of Western science about thinking about objectivity. The first of them is this idea of truth to nature, where, and this is, and I apologize for not having time to have pulled out specific images to represent these. The truth to nature, sort of might be best represented by, if you can imagine those kinds of classical kinds of botanical illustrations where you've got like sort of a plant or maybe even a cross-section of plant with all the diagram, all the parts labeled, and so forth. And the important thing is that these images are not necessarily an actual plant. They're not necessarily drawing a specific plant out in, sort of out in the wild. What they're drawing is some kind of ideal type of plant that represents the features of this species of plant as faithfully as they possibly can. And so the image is not intended to represent, sort of some kind of, an actual plant. It's just meant to represent the ideal plant and use the image to draw out those features. This is then, sort of changed around, not just around, but, importantly around the development of photography and other techniques of recording, whereby the emphasis moves to, sort of mechanical objectivity. And that is, sort of an actual picture. Yeah, this is, we're not mucking around. This is what the actual thing is. This is the picture of the object and what it looks like. It's a photograph or it's some other, sort of realistic, even if it's an astronomical drawing. It's a drawing that's done exactly as you would see it see the astronomical object in the night sky. So the idea that objectivity is to try to visually represent as faithfully as possible the object of study. This then moves into structural objectivity, where we move more into those ideas of those paper tools that I showed before, whereby what you're trying to capture is not so much the image of the object itself, but the processes, the dynamics, the law, the laws of science that underlie the thing. And then finally, sort of particularly into the 20th century, there's this idea that even the most faithful of diagram or the most complex of, most faithful of photograph or the most complex of diagram actually doesn't speak for itself, can't be interpreted. It is actually somewhat meaningless without the person, the expert who knows what it means. And so then objectivity is not situated, sort of neutrally with respect to an image, but with respect to the ability of a particular expert to be able to interpret that. So we move, sort of into trained judgment. As I said, this is incredibly important and influential. It's one of those works that will always be cited in studies like this. That doesn't mean it hasn't, and that ensures that it has been much criticized as well. And in particular, the idea that this is some kind of strict chronological sequence in which it happened. In fact, we can see elements of sort of truth nature representation in 20th and 21st century science. We see, sort of elements of structural objectivity representation back in the 17th and 18th century. These are not necessarily a neat chronological progression. It's probably better to think of them as aspects which have a, sort of maybe a very broad chronological trajectory, but certainly overlap and messy. That's probably been, one of the main areas that work's been criticised, but, nonetheless, that obviously holds up pretty well. So moving on to, sort of the reading that I suggested. And so you'll know, sort of from doing it that James Elkins comes from an art history background, which is quite interesting. And I've always, sort of been interested in that perspective of him being an art historian coming into this idea of looking at scientific images. And, sort of he makes the point in that, sort of that's very, sort of he draws on and is reminiscent of, well, I mean, much of his work was before objectivity. Sort of reflects similar concerns to Daston and Gallison, that these images are doing particular kinds of cultural work in the space of science. They are representing, so that's the trace of the sonar diagram on the left, where he's saying, like, pointing out that this is flattening out into a two-dimensional image, a serpentine path of a particular research vessel through the water that is both, sort of representing particular structural features of the lake. It's showing the existence of fish and the motion of fish in the particular patterns they do, overlaid with, sort of the information of, sort of depths for so far. And then, of course, sort of imaging artifacts as well. So it's like this incredibly complex image that is representing, sort of a range of different things at the same time. And, sort of, we've got the image of the virus, which again, sort of said before that when you sort of think about that sequence of images, there are strong, sort of elements of that truth to nature sort of shown within a diagram with that. That's obviously not an image of a particular virus. It's an attempt to draw out, sort of essential structural features of the virus, sort of within a particular, so, sort of drawing on, which I said in the previous slide and earlier, the interpretation of images like this can only occur within a particular, sort of visual culture. So it's not really in this particular paper that I got. I would have loved to have set you all the actual full length book of that, but I thought that might be, sort of a little bit mean with a week's notice. But the article that you read is basically one chapter in that. I always like the fact that I've managed to annotate it with a little copy thing on that, which I reckon Elkins would be really appreciative of that. But so this is, sort of one of the resources that Elkins, sort of, develops, and which I think is, sort of I think it's quite useful. I mean, it's kind of simple, but it's kind of useful. And so the argument being that, sort of we can't just sort of separate images into art images and, science images or representative or, communicative images which don't have any kinds of pictorial elements to them, or they don't have important pictorial elements to them. They're just, they're just information. on a page versus the, sort of the real images that art historians want to look at. So he says, like, it's a mistake to do that because, in understanding how these scientific images function within scientific culture, you have to attend to those kinds of visual elements, pictorial elements that, we were looking at on the last slide. And so he says, like, sort of that you can think of, instead of thinking of that as art or non-art distinction, think about images as containing these three elements. They've got the kind of textual elements to them, they've got the pictorial elements to them, but they've also got the notational elements to them, which is that kind of, sort of informational reference. And you can get the different blends of those different kinds of elements in any particular picture, but, sort of both art and non-art pictures should be considered in this kind of tripartite way rather than in a simple binary. And so as I said, like, I've always found that, just a really useful way of thinking through images in my own work. The second half of the book, sort of he goes on to then particularly look at those kinds of relationships between different pictorial elements and how, sort of the different kinds of structural relationships between elements within a picture can help make sense of them, again, both in a scientific and non-scientific thing. And one of the, sort of interesting way that he builds the argument out through this is looking at the development of ideographic languages in the first place, which is, again, something that we've, we've had a look at in previous seminars, and showing that, sort of as you move in the development of these systems from things that are, sort of, largely pictorial through to notate to being purely forms of writing in their own way, that you can see that transition that sort of occurs through the way that the different images are put in relationship to each other. But just one, this is just sort of one final example of sort of how we might think through these different sort of elements of what Elkins is talking about, but sort of in map studies, certainly map studies involved in the humanities, of course, because we're in the humanities, we always go, what are we doing? What's the, what is our field all about? So one of the questions that comes up in those kinds of critical cartography is what actually makes a map? And, obviously that's it's a complex question. I'm not going to give a simple answer to, but I think, sort of people could, sort of all agree that what's on the left is not a map. It's a list of suburbs. Just listing out suburbs is not itself a map. Even a satellite image, even though that's, sort of that's showing, sort of the image of inner Melbourne quite nicely, but is that a map? It's probably not actually a map. It's just a photograph. But as soon as you sort of start putting cycle paths and, sort of labels on it, we'd all, instantly recognize, okay, that is a Google map, but it doesn't even have to be that pictorial, probably just like a little sketch, like, sort of that on the top right, which has, sort of very, minimal pictorial elements to it, is, would be recognized as a map. So it's actually this blend, we can only sort of understand what a map is by thinking through the blend of, sort of of the picture, the text, and the notation on it. So, that's just an example of, sort of how that kind of framework can be useful for thinking through images. So, as said, hopefully we can just, sort of have a discussion about, what people think, and maybe we can get into what the relationship to cultural astronomy with this is, but conclusions are, as sort of I said there, and I've already gone through there, that the interpretation of specific images is with respect to visual cultures, but we understand that these cultures, sort of have a history. But interestingly, images do, sort of are one of the ways that they have the capacity. It's not to say that images always do. So images can be you know, we can all think of examples where some images can just be completely opaque if you're not from the culture or not close to the culture, but they certainly have the capacity to, you know, sort of engage across cultures. But to understand how that's doing, I would say you do need to go beyond simple art, non-art binaries. And I, for one, have always found that work of Elkin's helpful in doing that. But there are many other, you know, resources in visual studies that you can look at for that as well. That's yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Martin. How about we take a few minutes? If anybody needs to, you know, do something for the next 5 minutes, we'll come back and we'll start some discussion about this.
Excellent. I'll get my Naismith images up in the meantime.
Awesome. Okay, now that we're back in, everybody enjoyed their holiday, right? We're going to have some discussion about this. Who got a chance to read the reading?
I'm just going to show some more pictures for.
I should never ask that question.
There's a difference between reading it and understanding it.
And skimming it.
Or ChatGPT, give me a half-page summary of what this paper means. Oh, that's it. Okay. You getting warm? We can open a window, eh?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, there you go. There's that too.
It's just
Well, before we hit the art history, so this is in the Science Museum in Britain. So that's the, you know, sort of actual plaster models that, you know, you can see that he built. He spent like decades doing this work.
And what was the time period for this?
Yeah, so he started. Yeah,
Oh, there it is.
He started building them around there. The work itself, the book that he made was 1883, I think, from memory. So that's give you a sense of like how long, like this was, you know, this really was his life's work after he so that's what the photographs ended up looking like. But you know, sort of mostly they were done, like I said, they were done to represent as faithfully as he could to what he saw observed through the telescope. But he did have there is some way to just move from one sharing to the other, isn't there? But I forget how it is. But there was the odd one where the side-on view wasn't, you know, sort of really what he was meaning to do, but like there were a few of those that came through. But interestingly, so one of the things that is really sort of interesting about this whole project is that it was not, you know, it was not by any means, you know, again, like sort of an unpartisan. This was all in the context of what is the origin of the craters on the moon, and the dominant view, but not universal view at that stage, was that it was volcanic in origin. And Naismith was a keen promoter of this fan. So a large motivation for this whole project was to prove that the craters were volcanic in origin. And he did that by doing comparisons. This is, you know, sort of actually a model of, you know, of an earthly volcano, but he's saying like, look, they've got the same features of it. There were a few people, including, you know, my old mate Richard Proctor, who was, you know, who were arguing for the impact origin of craters, but it wasn't really until the 1920s, 1930s that theory started to become dominant. And so, you know, sort of Naismith's also got these like classics, like sort of, this is so this is the kind of visual arguments that are used. This was a visual argument by analogy that the moon was shrinking, and that features of the moon, including the origin of the so-called volcanism, were as a result of the shrinking of the surface and the consequent wrinkling that was going on. And so this is, sort of with the apple and the old person's hand, intended to demonstrate that that's what that is also what's happening to the moon.
Pareidolia. So it's interesting that the essential uplift was the volcanic cone, complex crater. Yeah. Well, this is something that comes up a lot in the cultural astronomy side because so much of indigenous knowledge is encoded in different artistic forms. So when we were looking at things like star map representations, one of the complaints we've received from not really people in the professional scientific community, but people in the amateur astronomy community in particular, would very much point out the lack of a one-to-one ratio or a certain kind of accuracy or even precision between a star map and its terrestrial counterpart. Not seeing it so much as a guide for waypoints on a map, but well, those don't look exactly point for point as exactly as they should. So how accurate can this be? Which was one aspect that was interesting. Another is this idea of it ties into the relationship of the exploratory archaeoastronomy that goes back and looks at things like rock art with minimal or no cultural context or information that looks for repeated patterns of cupules or groove marks or things and claims they represent constellations. And the idea is that you would basically take a photograph or a rendition of this, you'd map out these patterns, you would place a grid, and that same grid you would scale it to different parts of the sky to see how accurate the positions of those cupules would be to positions of stars in the sky. And the greater the fit between the star map and the cupules would indicate an increased degree of objectivity to support the argument, despite the fact I don't think any of us would be very good at actually writing down. I mean, even the one artwork you showed of the comet with the Big Dipper in the background, that one, was it Doobie and what's the two at the end of the Dipper?
Oh, yeah, don't ask
One of
me.
them's way off, and he's like, "Whoa, that looks really wild," but you can tell what the constellation is. But these,
I think the location of it all, I think the Dipper was pretty, I don't think that was an accurate representation of this guy. I think he put the Dipper in because that was
recognizable, right? But I mean, how many people have tried to interpret artists' paintings of the sky, trying to figure out the exact date and location they did it, assuming that what they're representing is a literal interpretation of what was there at the time.
So, I mean, obviously, I've already indicated I'm not in a very good position to speak on those matters, but I think, sort of some things I point to from, what I was referring to is to, acknowledge that even scientific images are not like, there's not some kind of simple form of objectivity in them. And even scientific images are not just scientific images. All of these images are kind of complex images. So interpreting, I mean, it's a mistake to interpret any image, but, I mean, to try and interpret an image from cultural astronomy as if it's, sort of some kind of photograph, I think is just, wrong-headed for, sort of all of these kinds of reasons.
I think the discussion we had when we first came in about Albo's t-shirt. What's the relationship of his t-shirt to this? Does anybody know? Okay.
Little green men.
The image on Joy Division's album of Guilty Pleasures, what is that image of?
Pulsar trace.
That's radio waves of pulsars, right? But also I mean, there's like 10 layers, but the implication of his political leanings or something like that because of the band name that utilizes that image and what it means. Anyway, I don't mean to digress. I just thought it was kind of interesting. I was like, actually, I thought about doing little movie posters of the courses we offer in physics, and I thought for the astrophysics, I want to get that same font they use for Joy Division and put astrophysics, but use that same image because that's what it is. Discussion? How does this relate to your work?
I've actually just been illustrating pottery shards in the OBL, so trying to get them as accurate as I can. Little drawings, but yeah, it's tedious. Like it takes a lot longer than you think. You've got like a tiny little shirt and you're like, how many dots are there? Wait, I've got to count it.
Some of the artworks of Billy Dum Harney, he implants not the right word. He integrates knowledge into the artworks themselves, right? So there are star maps that explain the narrative between characters that are represented by those objects in the sky. And one of them, for example, the Milky Way, or Scorpius exactly would be seen as a lizard, which is not an uncommon one. It's seen as a crocodile, but it's got a really curved tail on it. But when he would put the artworks on paper, because the way he liked to design the aesthetic of the artworks, he wouldn't show it with a curved tail. He says, well, yeah, it's a Milky Way, but we know what it is. Who cares if it looks exactly like we think it's supposed to look in the sky? So with a lot of the indigenous artworks, and it goes with any cultural artworks, is really interesting to see how you have this blend of knowledge transmission, representation of what you're looking at, but also the aesthetic to make it interesting and engaging. So when we had Lynn Kelly in early in the year talking about memory and how that ties in, if something isn't engaging, it's not going to be very memorable and you're not going to pay attention to it, which is like why having just even giving a simple SciComm talk and having imagery as your main focus and making the images interesting is going to get people to engage in what you're doing, as opposed to just having some of the more physics type talks where it's just a blast of text and high intensity images to convey as much information as possible that you're not going to be able to retain or understand at all. Trying to seed some discussion in here.
Do you think there's any benefit to actually having that online device?
I don't see a lot of use in it. I mean, you know, as again, Elkins is coming from an art history perspective, and I think, you know, he would argue that binary has existed largely as a form of gatekeeping from within their particular discipline that they've, you know, we are defined by being the people who study the real art.
So would you say that there for a long time has been an elitism around this whole discussion?
Are there any art historians in the room that I'm going to offend?
Yes and no. Not at all. Yes, there's absolutely been a shitload of elitism.
Yeah. And so there's a combination of like, you know, sort of, yeah, like so people like art historians who are just until recently and probably even now just not interested in looking at these kinds of images because they're not worthy of their study. And then, you know, but I did also start from that from a historian bias as well until, you know, say, you know, 20 years ago, you know, sort of something of a bias against treating images seriously as evidence. So there's sort of been elitism, but also just sort of, you know, ignoring it.
That reminded me, in a recent assignment I did, I was looking into the planning of Persepolis, the ancient Persian Achaemenid capital. And I like the earliest, like when it was first discovered and scholars were first discussing it, many of the scholars were just referring to the architecture as boring and plain and everything, just comparing them to like the classical architecture. And it's so, I don't know, striking to me that professionals and experts can like use those what is the word? Pejorative, thank you. Pejorative words to describe architecture that like just like expressing such negative language to those kinds of things. Yeah.
Like value judgments.
I mean, I often decry brutalist architecture, even though I've got a secret love for it.
I remember, you know, again, not that I've, you know, sort of engaged in the space very much, but when I was doing my master's years and years ago, I remember reading a material anthropology study which attempted to build an index for the, I kid you not, complexity of various kinds of technology, basically based on counting the number of different moving parts that they had, and thereby concluded that Indigenous Australian technology was generally of low complexity because, you know, it was simple and, you know, it's like, I was just going, oh my God. I closed closed the book and moved on. But yeah, I mean, this idea that complexity or ornamentation is inherently superior to, you know, sort of simplicity and, you know, sort of practicality is
It's also just
incredibly.
incorrect, like Persepolis is ornate as fuck. It's like so decorative.
It's got like the reliefs on the stairwells.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but those as well have been argued to just be like boring because they're so repetitive and there is no detail and there's just like amateurish cartoons compared to like what the Greeks had. And it's like just like rooted in the classical bias of the recent centuries, but yeah.
Do you think we still suffer from that bias of like favoring the Greco-Roman world over anything else?
Like, you mean like Trump's ballroom? There's lots of ornate gold stuff for the sake of having ornate gold stuff. Well, yeah, it is.
Well, did you see the recent billboard where Trump, it says Cyrus the Great is back with an image of Trump? Yeah.
Wouldn't be allowed in the country these days.
That's very true.
Wow, yeah. And they would look at something as complex as the Antikythera mechanism, which it seems by all evidence didn't actually work very well at all anyway. There's all kinds of intricate moving parts, but at one point it just falls apart. So how advanced is it if it doesn't serve the function it was intended to?
There was a part within the reading, where it's like wider meanings in inexpressive images that gets to what's inside here as well. And it's the part where it's also talking about like photos of stars. It's around page 7 and 8. And it's like talking about Lynch Hagen's work. I think it kind of speaks to this idea as well of just like trying to find the detail and find the meaning in images that are typically unexpressive and don't have that like that obvious kind of to our Western mind, that obvious like meaning behind it because it is that different culture. I have no idea where I'm going with this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, so I mean, I talked about the, you know, sort of Daston and Gallison's idea of, you know, sort of trained judgment that that these images, no images, you know, can be fully interpreted without the context of the expertise. But I mean, that's, you know, clearly true of cultural images as well, that, you know, we can look at them, you know, through that lens of objectivity, but it's a, you know, an objectivity of trained judgment, not an objectivity of, you know, of mechanical realism.
I find this ties in a lot with the Aboriginal art market. So you'll have artists who create art that conveys knowledge, maps, culture on canvas, to say paintings, right? Over time, those become, there's still knowledge encoded in them. And you could argue that from the perspective of those artists and their communities, the purpose of that artwork is to convey and record that knowledge, whether it's memorable or whatever. But that's the point of it. That exact same image, if you go to an art gallery in the city to try to buy it, it's not sold based generally on the knowledge that it contains, but almost purely on the aesthetic. And when you read anything about it, it tells you the artist from here, it's canvas of these dimensions, here's a kind of stuff. Oh, it's water dreaming, fire dream, that's it. And people will buy it purely based on that. So you almost have that dichotomy in that kind of market based on whether it's aesthetic or informative, purely based on who's looking at it and why. But I see a lot of art as well, that those artists over time, when they're cranking out the same thing, yeah, it's still got that meaning, but there's a push to use certain things that are going to appeal to particular people. Like I bought an artwork that had a lot of blue ink in it, and they're like, that's not something that was really used that much traditionally. That's a lot to sell to Westerners, get them to buy it. And I'm like, well, guilty, I bought it.
Also, just a question. Who do you consider like if one of the like key aspects in the discussion of art is the information it's trying to convey, is a well-formatted spreadsheet art?
If you look back and it shows an image of something, you know.
Yeah, but you actually had them. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
The Mandela's, you know, first
yeah, you did. Yeah.
periodic table is bit like a spreadsheet, it's a little bit tedious, it has lots of information in it. But our modern version is now very pictorial, such that you can stick it on the wall and color code it or do a whole lot of things, and people go, oh yeah, that's the 3 5s, that's the blah blah blahs. Whereas it's sort of transformed. So I don't know.
So is the criteria, does it make it on a t-shirt?
Yeah, I always sort of think about it, you know.
So you go back to that argument again. I mean, exhibit A. We can derive one from the other, can't you?
I mean, more so like you did read.
Oh, yeah.
You know, would it be something that communicates something to others? I mean, it might be.
I mean, without answering a question, I mean, the advantage again of the, sort of Elkin scheme is that you can look at, I mean, the Kevin's example notwithstanding, you would say that that spreadsheet has very low pictorial elements, but it, is high in textual elements, potentially high in notational elements, depending on exactly what it is. So that's, you kind of analyze it, it's that kind of an image rather than sort of saying, is it art or is it not art? It's that's what it's doing in the world.
Can I think of an example of the thing, just ask some pictures of that? Is that all right? And then let's just
Yeah, yeah.
You go ahead, Aisha.
Oh, I was just gonna say, you get it up while I'm ranting. Moving on. There was that one artist who put a toilet seat in an art gallery. So I think like the definition of what is art and who gets to decide that, it's very much depends on like who produced it and the general reception of it.
Great, sorry.
The Bengals.
Yes.
Yeah, with the spreadsheet, I was going to mention the celestial diagrams of the New Kingdom Egypt as well, because as you say, that's like shown out, they're just columns with data essentially.
Well, yeah, I was gonna ask,
Mm.
so to those of you who've not seen like a text like this before, what, is this a text? Is this an image? Is this a diagram? What does this look like to you?
Looks like our spreadsheet should look like it.
I think the author of the spreadsheet should be in there.
Yeah.
If your Excel spreadsheet doesn't look like this,
Yeah. I'm gonna try.
Data, yeah.
I'm gonna try and transform any Excel spreadsheets into Egyptian version.
Is that-
rows 81 to 85 are suddenly going diagonally on the page?
It looks to me a lot like the Mayan codices where the mathematical symbols are dots and straight lines and different stacks and sequences.
Yeah.
There are actually, I mean, nearly all of the text that you can see on this part of the image is dates,
Mm.
numbers, dates.
Yeah.
Any other, I mean, what is this typically thing? Just, again, there is a right answer, but I'm not interested.
It is
right. Yeah.
I like to answer this.
Good.
Okay, because this is the sky being held up, correct?
Yeah.
Yes. Is this eclipses or celestial phenomenon?
It has to do with celestial phenomena. It doesn't have anything to do with eclipses, but you are right. So you said it? Yeah.
Not or root.
Yeah.
This isn't some kind of Venetian cyanotic cycle thing, is it?
This is so like I just said, the big woman that you see, or the female figure that you see on the top, stretched out with their arms down at her
Oh,
own
right.
This is Moot, the sky goddess. The guy holding her up in the middle is Shu, who is the sort of god of air or sunlight, or the bright atmosphere. What's this thing with the falcon wing descending at her mouth?
The sun, so it's the passage of the sun through the sky.
Yeah, well,
is it the setting or the rising sun? I
It's
forgot.
the setting because the rising comes out of her vagina.
yeah, and you can see it there, very small, and then again at her foot, where it comes down under her eye. So in this text, the sun doesn't go around us, it goes across the sky underneath her body, then it goes into her mouth and through the sky at night, and then is reborn the morning after. But the thing that's interesting here, like you look at this was going back to what Jack and Andrew were talking about before. This is a sort of anthropomorphic depiction of these two divine figures, but they're set up in a way that makes them very reminiscent of the hieroglyphs used to denote these concepts. So Newt's body is shaped, sort of misshaped for a human body, but shaped very much like the ideogram for the sky. Shu is shaped like the full sail that is the ideogram for air. The earth that he's standing on is in some versions of this text depicted as another anthropomorphic figure, but here it's just depicted as a big thing like that, which is again hieroglyph for earth. So there's like an element that we can see if we don't read Egyptian, where it looks very much like a naive depiction of the cosmos using these anthropomorphic figures, but to a literate Egyptian reader, it would very much signal that these are symbols, that you can talk about nature and talk about the sky through the use of these sort of symbolic depictions of them, rather than I don't know, it's really not like a naive, there's a big guy who holds up the sky and the sky is a big woman picture. Anyway, sorry, that's going too far into it. Sorry.
And then in terms of the, just as an image of those artifacts of the imaging, or is that like the reconstruction of the cracks in the surface? Is that
The white?
Yes.
Yeah, that's just damage on this particular version. There are a couple of other versions to go on.
So what do the what are the dates correspond to?
That's a very good question. What can you make out of the dates?
They're in columns.
Yeah, they're in columns. Yeah, there's 3 dates in each column. One for Musset, one for birth, one for something called Sipit.
These are the list of kings, and is it no?
No, it's about stars.
Is it the decans of the sky in the Egyptian calendar or the astronomical?
Are there 60 there?
There's 38, and 2 of them are duplicates, so there's 36.
We discussed this in class. I remember this was addressed in
I may have probably told you about it. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, wait.
It's 12 times 3.
Yeah.
So
It's very close. So it's a way of dividing the sky into 36 units of 10 days apiece, where you identify stars that are rising on the horizon at 10-day intervals. The issue is that most of these dates don't actually correspond to any star. These seem to be mostly theoretical stars that are it's basically the behavior of Sirius duplicated 36 times across the year to divide the calendar into a 360-day period, each marked by the rising of, in most cases, a purely hypothetical star.
These stars name.
Only 8 of them are named, and the rest are nameless, because there is no star that you can point to that says it rises on this date, it culminates at this date, and then it disappears at this date. You can only attain this list by assuming that the behavior of Sirius is some sort of ideal that you can then repeat across the entire year in a way that allows you to come up with a 360-degree division of the.
Well, it's interesting. I thought it might be some kind of correction to try to synchronize the lunisolar calendar, but one of the interesting things about Sirius itself is its particular declination, especially from the latitude of where Egypt is such that even though you experience precession and equinoxes, it still doesn't hardly impact its position.
Yeah.
So like its position when it rises and sets is still almost the same as it was 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. Like its changes, it's just in the right sweet spot where it doesn't seem to matter.
And it's extremely bright. It's extremely
Brightest star in the sky, yeah.
So anyway, this is just illustrating my point. I didn't need to hijack the entire thing, but this is a good case of that you need to learn like a visual language that is not always apparent from what you're presented with in a picture in order to start seeing what people are getting at these things. Often they're more sophisticated than you can tell. Yeah.
Ashley?
The Heliocal rising of Sirius is especially important in Egypt because it aligns with the annual inundation of the Nile. So like their calendar is very aware of that.
Well, the floods that would cause the floods that would feed, especially down the floods that would feed Lake Victoria what's known as Lake Victoria. It's a very colonial name. I don't know the traditional names for it, but that seasonal flooding is what would cause those pulsations. And I remember reading about the Mersey, who are people along the Omo in southern Ethiopia, and they would the same flooding that would occur with the Nile would occur with the Omo River, and there'd be different pulsations of the flood that would come based on that, and they would practice flood retreat agriculture. So they would have to know they plant crops along the river, but if they did it too early, they get washed out. If they did it too late, they would dry out. So they had to get the timing of it. So they would use the pointers and then beta and delta of the Southern Cross as sort of hands on an analog clock when they would set at each point roughly correlated to the timing of the pulsations, which I thought was quite fascinating. Cool.
If you were curious, do you know about the celestial ceiling of Senanenmut's tomb as well? Yeah, it's also very interesting, very similar to the one you showed, but also has some circular diagrams as well, which is very fascinating.
What do you make of those?
Well, all the different decans seem to me like the different areas of the sky, and it seems more spatial than what you said, like where it's just Sirius repeated through every day of the year. So I can't remember. It's been a long time since I've looked at it, but I do think it's possible to infer like more of potential constellations and stars if it just Egyptian astronomy from those.
Yeah.
Not from the circular diagrams. I haven't really looked into those, but above panel. Yeah.
So the issue here is you can of course identify like groups of stars that rise at about 10 days apart on the horizon. But this text goes further in trying to say each of these stars has a date of rising of it can't be a combination in a technical sense because it just doesn't fall on the right date, but some kind of reaching a point in the middle of the sky and a date of setting. And for each of these stars, they're exactly the same. There's always 70 days between setting and rising. The east again, there's always like 200 days between rising and the thing that translates combination. But that can't be right because the magnitude of a star, like that's going to affect when it appears to rise on the horizon for you, because it has to be brighter than the sun as it goes down or up. And that's not going to be a factor when it reaches this top point in the air, because the sun's already down at this stage. So you would actually have, if you went by the canonical Decan star lists, stars ought not to rise in the same order that they culminate.
One of the things, well, this is an interesting discussion because earlier when I sent that email out about today, I was trying to look up, well, like, is there something astronomical related to Samhain? And part of it was it was a culmination of the Pleiades at midnight. And I'm kind of like, So I looked into it. I was like, that applies roughly 300 years ago, but not 2,000 years ago at all. So starting to look a little bit more into that. And then we had the discussion, Prem and I were chatting earlier, when we're looking at this sort of stuff, when you're looking at celestial navigation, there's that 5-degree altitude on the horizon below which is usually cloud. But even without cloud, if we look at things that are, more than maybe third magnitude in the sky, anything below 5 degrees is going to reach an extinction angle. It means it's not going to be generally visible. So when Brad Schaefer was developing a more practical, observational-based algorithm for how to observe Haleica rising and setting, for a sunrise and sunset, you would need the sun to be no less than 10 degrees below the horizon when the star is no less than 5 degrees above the horizon. So there's a 15-degree difference, but not any 15 degrees. Exactly those boundary conditions would give it its minimum. So if you measure things when they're at the horizon versus 5 degrees above the horizon, that could, depending on its declination, could blow time out a little bit, especially when you start looking at that solar point. But also it's going to depend on the star's color and its brightness versus how high or low that angle would be. So there's some interesting things that tie into that.
Atmospheric refraction on the atmospheric conditions on the horizon will also shift things by a few degrees.
Yeah, if they're like obstacles, depending on where you are being shaped for.
Yeah.
But so your theoretical Siriuses are all exactly the same declination and the same magnitude as Sirius, just spaced out around in right ascension.
Like the bad problem is, of course, the farther you are from the pole, the more time you will spend And the less time you'll spend visible in the sky as a star, and this claims every star has exactly the same period of visibility throughout the year.
Oh, right.
It has to be just like an extrapolation of data from this one observation.
Yeah, this thing applies everywhere.
Yeah.
Almost a bit of numerology tied in with that. Yeah. Well, interesting. So the Egyptians used the earlier Sumerian division by 60. So, because degrees are arbitrary, right? But 60 was used because of a number of different factors. One is that every multiple 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4, 4, they all are all whole numbers all the way up to that. So a lot of later cultures use that earlier Sumerian aspect. Was that the case with the Egyptians? Because they're trying to go for a 360-degree day. It's sort of the same.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. So the 360-day thing, before this text is written, they've already got a 365-day calendar, which is divided. I mean, it's the best calendar in antiquity. It's the most. It takes a long time to stop working.
Yeah.
But it needs this sort of period of 5, what they call epigonal days, added to it. They divide the year into 12 months of exactly 30 days a piece, 360 days, and then you have 5 that fall outside the calendrical month. So this seems to be working from, and it's not clear that that's actually inherited from Sumerian concepts. They start to use, Babylonian mathematics, maybe in the 6th or 5th century, but not necessarily.
That's the same reason we have 31 days in a calendar, basically, every other month, right? Yeah.
Can we start a petition to get that back? Like 30-day, 12 months, and then 5 intercalary days?
Yeah.
So much easier, so much better.
Well, so people were arguing on social media, how come we don't just have 12 days of, was it 12 months of 29 days or whatever it was? And I'm like, well, that seems nice. The problem is over time, your calendars are going to go out of sync.
Yeah.
And, December is going to be in March or something like that, what you're used to thinking, but also all those holidays you like to base things on, which are based on lunar or solar calendars or some combination of the two, are going to get thrown out of whack. So that synchronicity has always been the biggest challenge.
The Egyptian calendar didn't have fully days, did it? Or leap years?
No, which is why it starts to go off track at some point.
But wasn't that the purpose of those 5 intercalary days?
Well, no,
Yeah, extra 3 days.
It's 365 and a quarter days. So every 4 years would be the
I
extra.
know the Julian calendar was based off the Egyptian one, and they changed it, introduced leap years.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Because I also, in that regard, I remember there's a historical anecdote from the Roman Civil War where Caesar was the Pontifex Maximus, so he was the one in charge of adjusting. So it was a lunar calendar at that point. He was in charge of adjusting the calendar anytime it began to go out of sync with the observed rotation. He'd been at war for 10 years and hadn't bothered to do it, and so he was able to. Pompey had fled to across I believe the Adriatic Sea is the one that leads to Greece, and made a crossing there, believing that it was the start of winter, and so that it would know that the sea became too rough to cross. Caesar knew that it was actually the calendar had shifted about 3 months, so they were actually in a different. It was actually getting towards the end of winter and going into a calmer period. And so he made a crossing that no one expected, and that was how he was able to kind of end this by chasing Pompey into this tough position, because the calendar was out of sync, and he was able to use that to his advantage because it hadn't been updated in a decade.
There's a really good book by Neil deGrasse Tyson wrote it. It's called we'll just move beyond that. But it's called Accessory to War, and it's talks about the uncomfortable relationship between astrophysics and the military. And of course, a lot of the later stuff is about the modern space history, but it goes back to ancient times and how military application was a huge part of that. And even today, like when the raid on Osama bin Laden happened, what time of the month did that happen? During new moon, right? So there's no moon in the sky. So those little things that go back are still utilized today in warfare. But it's quite fascinating to look at how that's always been such an integral part of astronomical knowledge. And it's why you've got the Naval Observatory and things like that. So
Any comments online?
isn't this up your road?
Perfect timing.
I don't think Amanda has any idea that she's focused on the screen here.
Yeah.
You know you're on the screen, Amanda, right? We're asking you questions, yeah. Isn't iconography one of your big areas, right?
It is. Sorry, I've been struggling to hear the conversation a little bit, and that was just the after school camp program calling to see where my daughter was. But anyway, I thought I better reply. Yeah, I think it's been really interesting, especially the history of how art and photographs and imagery hasn't really been taken as seriously. I found that quite a lot when I was doing iconography studies of Phoenician and Canaanite art. They're often quite dismissed in preference to written material, of which there is very little to none. So it became really challenging to get some of the ideas and concepts accepted because they said that there's already a clear narrative. But I think art, it's not singular meaning. Like most artists will say that there's multiple meanings to a piece of art in particular. And I often like to quote, I think it was Feldman who said that it's a selection of the natural world, not an inventory of it. So they're making deliberate decisions about what they're portraying in their art, and they're using very specific iconography in order to share that message. And obviously, when we don't have full written transcripts, we're never going to know the exact meaning of everything that's there. But if we have a good working knowledge, we can at least try and decipher some of the potential meaning of the iconography. So especially when clear symbols are being used, like in Canaanite art, they used a lot of Egyptian art, where we know what they meant in the Egyptian context as well, the Mesopotamian art iconography as well. I could ramble about this for ages, but yeah, it's hard to sometimes get people to take it seriously because it's viewed as an artistic piece without any potential scientific or other merit whatsoever. That was a crowd stopper.
The culture of advanced because the like the one for also the art is where technology is not productivity not here or here. All of us in the US at the time. All of the things that also is going to go that's one thing. We like this category of art that excludes things that are literally, but also that wasn't really great. So it was no, yeah, no notion of like art that was kind of public play.
Well, I'm curious about Bridget, your work ties in quite interestingly with this. So
Yeah, I've had a lot of thoughts during the reading. One thing I think is kind of interesting was what we're talking about, I guess, these sort of pictograms, is the idea that they're not art, let's say, but they often are successful initially without any contextual learning because they rely on visual principles that all humans can look at and interpret something from it. So the idea that, you know, you've got a square here and dots inside without any extra sort of explanation, you would say, obviously that's a group of things inside some sort of wall or boundary in there, sort of contained within that. That sort of like meaning is kind of implicit due to cognitive sort of innate qualities that we're born with. Obviously, there's a lot of contextual information out of it, culture, but that sort of goes to the constellation figures, I think, that so I'm looking at more the idea of prototypical cases. So if you when we're learning about dogs when you're a kid, you know, you sort of learn like maybe you look at a 5-year-old's like dog, and maybe they see like a chihuahua and they're like cat. And you're like, no, that's still a dog. And you have to sort of continually update your prototypical model of what belongs to a category. But looking at crocodiles and lizards, they have the same prototypical structure, which is a long body, 4 legs, a head, and a tail. And so it kind of doesn't necessarily matter what the actual animal is that's represented. It's cross-cultural in the sense that we understand it as certain animals that belong to that category, if that makes sense. But that's sort of just very at the cognitive level, I think, of what's successful in these pictograms when you look at even simplistic scientific models of things that they maybe before explanation still communicate something, I think, which is maybe sort of what I thought about spreadsheet is.
Yeah, if it's not visually.
Yeah, if you don't necessarily get an impression straight away.
Yeah.
For me, I would wonder if that's in the world, I guess, not pictograms. But it also made me think of working in UX and graphic design. And I don't know if anyone's heard about, there's this, there was a project where they were trying to develop a symbol that could exist from now into the future of a nuclear waste site. And the challenge of trying to find one image that would communicate that to anyone. And it's just so fascinating because I think it sort of taps into this, right, where it's like, how do you, it's actually very hard to get a single meaning from an image. Actually, I think a lot of people have lots of different interpretations, all symbols, all the time. There's great art for that.
Have you seen that film? What's it called? Containment. That's like it's very interesting. It's kind of wild.
About those sites.
Yeah, it's about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
And about the like the different, like, because they did, they had, I forget how many it was, like might have been 20 different people that to try and come up with their plan, like what's your plan for, and some of them are like crazy. So like, but it goes through and like, goes through all of those different, talks about the issue, which is very serious, but then also goes into some of the crazier of the, schemes that have come up. So
it's interesting.
Fascinating.
And last thing I'll say actually was the girl with curly hair painting. I just had to look up what the artist was. Simon, who I'm going to go celebrate his birthday. One of the first things I remember learning from him in colour perception in undergrad was Vermeer has much earlier than any scientific knowledge had expressed the understanding about how light and shadow changes colour and how we perceive colour. So you're saying sort of pigment in different shadows looks to the eye a different colour, and he was far ahead of the scientific understanding of it. And it sort of just made me think about the end of that paper, because he talks about like this sort of arbitrary delineation between science and art, when there's a lot of scientific work in art and a lot of art in work in science. That's my whole thoughts on that. All in one go.
I was just curious then, you might not have an answer, but do you have an opinion of what would be the best sign for the future for nuclear waste?
I did debate this a lot with some of the designers, because I thought like a skull, right? Like a skull, but someone had a good argument about finding out it's so good, because it might just be like, this is a grave site. And some people...
The pirates!
Yeah, like to raid tombs, right? So people might be like, well, maybe there's a whole bunch of gold buried under like people's stuff, so it's like, how do you trying to show death, I think, and like how do you express death?
And another point to the skull as well is like, if archaeologists 1,000 years from now was familiar with our culture at all, they might see skull emojis or skull graffiti as like a symbol of being cool or edgy as well.
I was going to jump in there. I've had this argument a lot in time as well. And everyone always says, let's do something scary, let's put out skulls. But speaking as an archaeologist, if I see a skull on something, the paint wouldn't even have dried before I'd be trying to break into it. You need to account for human stupidity. I think the only answer to that is oral history. Just pass down the stories the same way that's done in Australia.
So you're saying there's no visual way to like delineate like a site, like a nuclear waste site, without the oral history alongside it?
Ask the Egyptians. They put up loads of hieroglyphs saying, do not enter here, death will follow. And the Victorians broke into each and every tomb.
Yeah. Well, one of the warning signs to look for is color, and red is almost universally seen as a warning sign. Well, I know.
Well, except Asian cultures, where modern cultures, where red is a sign of marriage and
Yeah.
blessings. So, and white
Yeah.
was often a death color.
In a lot of the cultural astronomy literature, red types of phenomena are commonly associated with negative. So meteors, depending on their color, would have either a universally bad meaning or a bad versus good, depending on the color. But the red was almost always the bad. The moon being red during the lunar eclipse is bad. Any type of celestial object when it's seen as red is not always, but pretty more often than not seen. I guess it'd be interesting to actually do a survey.
Yeah, we'll find.
An unhappy, frowny face. You make a frowny skull? I think what they'd be learning is not possible to do it, because even if you tell people you're going to die, people are going to do it anyway, just because they're not supposed to. Or that's just it's a conspiracy theory to tell me I can't do that.
Yeah.
What is it? Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah, like that.
So, yeah, of course, I've got Peter Gallison, who already had in the seminar. I think the basic answer is that you can't like do it in 20,000 times.
Yeah. Of course, fall out. I guess that's off and you'll be long dead before it's a problem. So like you're not gonna know if it's successful or not.
Well, I think the consensus is you wouldn't be able to 100% do it. That idea of objectivity versus subjectivity. You're never going to reach pure objectivity, but that doesn't mean you can't get somewhere asymptotically close to that, perhaps. That you may not be able to tell everybody, but you can tell a number of people that someone.
Of orientation variant, like perspective. So we understand that if a bowl like this, we see just like a 2D screenshot of a bowl like this. We know that we can picture it from every single angle. And just animals can't. And so like some symbols we would understand maybe the 3D representation of it, but potentially another species would. So you feel like trying to represent a nuclear power plant in 2D. You necessarily communicate that it's a 3-dimensional thing.
Dolphins take over.
Yeah.
Right. I was thinking like a football would be an interesting example, whereas if you see it as a circle with a dot in the middle, you know it's danger because it's literally coming straight at you.
So I think the key takeaways I've got today is that a spreadsheet is not art. Colorful spreadsheet might be art.
Yeah.
And the biggest threat to archaeologists is digging up radiation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the most confusing. Yeah.
But also, I think this highlights one of the challenges in trying to do what I see done a lot in archaeoastronomy and in broader cultural astronomy is literal interpretations of things
Yeah.
with the base assumption that they're going to achieve some kind of one-to-one ratio of precision or accuracy to what you're looking at, whether that's, oh, this is representing constellations, we're going to see how accurate it does. If you look at some of the old research papers in the edited volume, they literally do that. This kind of looks like the Southern Cross, but let's analyze this. And why is that being analyzed? One of my arguments, so I'm not the first to propose this, is less about that's a worthwhile way of doing it, but more, well, if a physicist or an engineer is going to do this, they're going to want to quantify everything and find out what the error bars are and how close, what's your sigma, like it's that methodological approach that it's put into that particular methodology from a different field that might not apply. And I wouldn't see why it should necessarily apply. But I've seen endless papers trying to do that exact thing continually. And they'll make an argument, oh, see, but it represents this very closely. But once you get to a certain degree, well, it represents it closely enough, you're going to find almost any star patternable because they're somewhat evenly distributed if you go deep enough.
Yeah, like even when people draw constellations in their experiments, someone's like, this is a dog, right? And it's like, it's a pretty square looking thing for a dog, right? But it's just enough to give you the vibe of something.
So it's Canis Major, right?
Yeah. For like a essentially options for ears, so I think that's a dog. And it's just like, it's so impressionistic, I think.
Yeah.
A lot of the constellations.
I guess it's kind of interesting if I gave you, like, if we did an experiment where you give somebody a narrative and says, encode that in the stars, they're going to make the stars fit to what the narrative needs to, versus saying, oh, this looks like that and that looks like that, and then coming up with a story based on the characters you developed. One is just more imaginative, the other one is more, would seem to me a little bit more pragmatic. Like I need to, how am I going to pass this information on? I'm going to code this in here, so I'm going to make these figures tie with these so it fits what I need it to. And also the timing might coincide with, well, it happens to have this animal which starts breeding when it rises in the morning here and sets in the evening there or something.
Yeah, it's I mean, I haven't gone that deep, but I think it's the ingenuity of associations that you can make, and like good storytellers who will take a little bit of truth and add a little flavor to make it interesting. But artists take things to the real world, so maybe you see one constellation and Noah chases this other one, and that as a storyteller allows you to just develop something quite rich and doesn't necessarily need to be accurate.
Yeah.
And to useful. Yeah. Yeah.
I did want to mention that a lot, most of us are, we're normally in the seminars together, but not everybody is necessarily going to know what everybody else's research is about. So just, I know this, it seems like something you do at the very beginning. Yeah. So what's your name and what's your research project? But it might be worthwhile. Don't go into a full abstract, but just talk about what your research is about or what your interest is about. So.
Yes. Yes. So I'm in psych, obviously, cognitive psychology, and I'm looking at the why there's commonalities between constellations across cultures of the globe. Going to do a little bit of narrative, but all that to a little bit of text analysis, but not full narrative. But yeah, so I'm looking at reasons that are to do with instead of cross-cultural overlap, which doesn't explain all the commonalities, but the idea that all humans are born with an innate human visual perception system that is common to all of us. That's basically overrides any sort of cultural, linguistic, temporal difference in the sense that it provides a unifying quality to how we see the world. And yeah, that's it.
So I'm working on celestial navigation, mostly looking at this question. That's but I'm just kind of looking at how it was actually done, seeing where there are gaps. A lot of the stuff was general stories about how it was done, but actually looking at if you're going from one place to another, what are the actual stars